As always, I want to thank the National Museum of the Pacific War for putting together this conference, and to Lauren Dollar and her wonderful team who took care of the myriad details that will make this conference a success. My job today is divided into two parts. I want to talk about how we should remember and commemorate these events, and secondly, to introduce our wonderful group of speakers who I think will both inform and entertain you. I've talked about memory and commemoration at this venue and other venues over the years, and I want to take the opportunity today to distill down a lot of my comments to their essence. This institution is known as the National Museum of the Pacific War. The Pacific War is a designation we've used since 1945 to describe the non-European part of World War II. The problem with this designation is that it only recognizes a war that took place across the Pacific between Japan and the United States, and chronologically only between December 1941 and August 1945. It only recognizes a few other nations and peoples involved. These include the Filipinos, the Australians, the Pacific Islanders, and the New Zealanders. This narrative essentially reduces the number of people involved in the Asia-Pacific War to about 25% of those who actually participated and covers only about 15% of the deaths. I believe the use of the term the Pacific War is both factually flawed and is morally perverse for reasons which I will address further as I go along. In reality, Japan's war began at least in July 1937 in China. That war was enormously expanded in December 1941. Eventually, the area that Japan would be involved in, I call the Arc of Asia. It starts in India on the west. It goes on an easterly bearing across China, Japan, the North and Central Pacific. It goes on a southeasterly bearing across Burma, French Indochina, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and on to the South Pacific. When you add up all the nations and peoples involved in the Asia-Pacific War, you get over 1 billion human beings. Now, the population of the world in World War II is normally put at about 2.3 billion. So the total number of people involved in the Asia-Pacific phase of World War II was about 44% of the total world population. By contrast, when you look at the European phase of the war, there were about 614 million people involved, and they constituted about 27% of the total world population. The world population at that time was about 2.3 billion people. This means that the nations and peoples involved in the Asia-Pacific War were about 44% of the total world population. And in the European phase of the war, the total number of people involved was about 614 million people, or about 27% of the total world population. If you put together both the Asia-Pacific and the European phase of the war, you get about 70% of the total world population. When you look at these numbers, this is why I think that the Pacific War narrative is simply inadequate to accurately cover the number of people that were actually engaged in the war. When it comes to deaths in the Asia-Pacific War, by a conservative count, the total number of deaths is about 25 million. Of that number, about 6 million were military personnel, soldiers, sailors, and airmen. These were divided between about 3 million Chinese, about 2 million Japanese, and the balance in much smaller numbers of all the other participating nations and peoples. The math tells you there were 19 million civilian deaths in the Asia-Pacific War. Of that 19 million, about 1 to 1.2 million at the high end were Japanese civilians. This included about 210,000 Japanese civilians who died immediately or latently at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The math tells you that for every Japanese civilian death, there were 18 or almost 18 million other civilian deaths who were not Japanese. Now, expressed visually, what those ratios show you is the following. That's what it looks like visually. On the far left are the total number of Japanese civilians represented in that one figure. If you carve out about 1/5 of that figure, you would have the total number of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These other 18 represent all the other deaths. They are overwhelmingly other Asians. About 2/3 of them are Chinese. The numbers tell us that 3 civilians died for every combatant who died in the Asia-Pacific War. I worked the numbers for the European phase of World War II, and at the highest end, the best I can do is almost 2 civilians dying for every combatant death. And that's primarily due to the enormous number of combatant deaths in what we call the Eastern Front in the European phase of World War II. When we come to the composition of the 18 million civilian deaths who are not Japanese in the Asia-Pacific War, China suffered not only the greatest number of total deaths, about 15 million, but by far the greatest number of civilian deaths. There are about 3 million Chinese military personnel who died. That means there are 12 million Chinese civilians who died during the Asia-Pacific War. They died between July 1937 and August 1945. This is a span of 2,962 days. If you simply do the math, that tells you that about 4,051 Chinese were dying every single day for almost 3,000 days in the Asia-Pacific War. From this base, we can discern further that when Japan expanded the war in December 1941, there were somewhere between 5.8 and 6 million other civilians who were not Japanese who died in the Asia-Pacific War. This total includes deaths in Indonesia. The most recent scholarly work on that shows that about 2.4 million Indonesians died on Java, and they died primarily from starvation in 1944 and 1945. In other words, there were about 100,000 Indonesian civilians dying every month for those 2 years, 1944 and 1945. The next greatest total of civilian deaths is in Vietnam. Now, at that time, Vietnam was part of French Indochina, along with Laos and Cambodia. In April 1945, a famine struck in northern Vietnam. At least 1 million Vietnamese died, although the Vietnamese maintained the number was actually 2 million. At 1 million deaths, that would be 200,000 Vietnamese dying every month from April to August 1945. When you add the Chinese, the Indonesians, and the Vietnamese civilian deaths, you get about 15.7 million deaths. Among the other nations and peoples involved in the war that Japan inflicted upon this area, there were about another 2.3 million deaths. Again, when we do the math, we see that among the civilians who were not Japanese or Chinese who died between December 41 and August 1945, that's about 5.8 to 6 million. And that works out to over 1,348 days. That works out to about 4,300 per day, up to 4,400 per day. When you combine the total number of deaths of the Chinese for the entire span, plus those additional deaths involving almost 6 million other Asian civilians, you get a total of 8,350 deaths per day every day for 45 months from December 1941 to August 1945. That is literally a total of about 250,000 deaths every month for 45 months. Finally, I noticed that I remarked that using the Pacific War narrative is actually perverse. And the reason for this is that basically it makes it appear as though the deaths in Japan are by far and away the greatest number of civilian deaths in the Asia-Pacific War. And of course, if we actually use the Asia-Pacific War narrative, we see that the Japanese are actually only about 6% of the total number of deaths in the whole Asia-Pacific War among civilians. And of that total, less than 2% die in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The other 94% of the deaths are overwhelmingly other Asians in these other nations that Japan conquered and occupied during its war. Now, let me turn from the taking of lives to the saving of lives. The instruction given to General Douglas MacArthur when the occupation of Japan began included a directive that the Japanese government would be responsible for feeding the Japanese people. He was further told that under the terms that Japan had agreed to surrender, ordinary Japanese people would not be held accountable for the crimes of Japan, and that ordinary Japanese would be returned to their homeland. There were about 6 million Japanese nationals living outside the home islands. They were split almost equally between military personnel and civilians. In addition to this, Japan was obligated to return to their homeland other civilians, other Asians who had been taken to Japan as slave laborers and treated horrendously with a tremendous death rate. Those people were also entitled to be returned to their homeland. The transfer of this millions of people across international borders created a perfect recipe for the spread of deadly diseases. Foremost among these were cholera, typhoid, and typhus, which were extremely lethal. Later Brigadier General Crawford Sams, was in charge of the American component of the occupation forces in charge of public health. He had a small staff of about 150 Americans and Japanese. He recognized that the situation was perfect for creating this series of epidemic diseases, and he moved immediately to free the Japanese medical establishment from its subservience to the Japanese militarists to give him a workforce. Under his direction, those Japanese medical personnel served as his shock troops to go forth and control outbreaks of diseases all over Japan. Those efforts controlled the diseases and also instituted a massive program of inoculations to head off further spreads of disease. In addition to this, SAMS instituted a whole series of medical reforms within Japan that achieved the absolutely astonishing result that he literally halved the annualized death rate in Japan during the occupation. That death rate had gone from 18.7 deaths per thousand per year, which was the customary way that was figured in 1940, which is to say before the war was expanded in 1941. And in 1952, the annualized death rate was 8.1 deaths per thousand per year in Japan. He had literally more than half the annualized death rate. According to the leading Japanese historian of the initial occupation, Eiji Takame, SAM's efforts saved about 3 million Japanese lives. This is about exactly equal to the total number of Japanese combatants and civilians who died in the entirety of the Asia-Pacific War. Now, amazingly enough, this was the lesser of the two American efforts to save Japanese lives during the occupation of Japan. During the first weeks of the occupation, Japanese authorities came forth and told General MacArthur and his staff that Japan's 1945 rice crop had collapsed and that Japan would be facing famine conditions in 1946. Initially, MacArthur and his staff were skeptical about Japanese claims, but by December of 1945, they had the statistics in on the Japanese rice crop, which showed that it was only about 6.4 million metric tons of rice, down from 10 million metric tons of rice. If you simply calculated the total available rice, the number of Japanese, and the number of days of 1946, you immediately realized that Japan would be facing a famine in mid-1946. MacArthur began his campaign to secure American food in large quantities in early 1946. He began with sort of just the facts statements about the realities of what the rice crop was, what the Japanese population was, and when you did the math, there was obviously going to be a famine in mid-1946. This made no impression whatsoever on Washington. Now, in defense of Washington, I would say that they were dealing with a great number of other issues, particularly in Europe, and they were very Eurocentric. When MacArthur's initial efforts of just the facts failed to move Washington, he went to Plan B, which one historian has called scare the hell out of them. Actually, what MacArthur did was he simply presented in a very dire form exactly what was going to happen if the Japanese did not receive any food relief. He depicted this as leading to a massive number of deaths from starvation in Japan in 1946. This would lead to civil unrest that as reduced occupation forces did not have enough bayonets to control. There would be a breakdown of civil order and no telling how many Japanese would die. Initially, this did not make much impression on Washington either, but eventually, by May of 1946, to his enormous credit, President Harry S. Truman recognized that MacArthur's pleas were valid, and he agreed that we would have to ship massive amounts of American food to Japan. Now, when you get the numbers that are given in the report by the occupation authorities on what happened next, you find that American food was feeding 15 million Japanese urban dwellers in July 1946. This is because it was the urban population, not the rural growers, who were at risk of death due to famine in 1946 in Japan. We fed 20 million Japanese in August and 15 million in September. This included 2.5 million Japanese who lived in Tokyo in July and August 1945. They were entirely dependent upon U.S. food for survival. As best I can figure, when you put together what SAMS achieved and what MacArthur and the American food achieved, you're looking at saving somewhere between 3 and 6 million Japanese lives, which is obviously between 1 and 2 times the number of Japanese lives that were lost in the entire Asia-Pacific War. You can go back to the 15th century, as far as I can tell, and you can find no other episode in which conquering power managed to save so many lives after having taken the number of lives it took in conquering its adversary. Now let me turn to how we should remember and commemorate these events. We are now beyond living memory of those who actually fought the war as well as those who were alive and were aware of the war as it went on. What we have now is a constructed national memory that's put together primarily by academics and to a degree by journalists. When I was a youth, you could count upon television and and the newspapers to note each year the anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day and VJ Day. Today, it's very rare for Pearl Harbor Day to be commemorated except on anniversaries like the 80th. We are, however, almost constantly reminded of the anniversary of VJ Day and the atomic bombing of Japan. The context of this mention of atomic weapons is typically not to reflect upon their role in ending the war and in stopping the gigantic slaughter of human beings due to Japan's war. And these were overwhelmingly other Asians who were non-whites, of course. And for a far more common narrative is one to question exactly whether the bombs were necessary and what they accomplished. So how do I think we should construct a public memory of these events? I believe our dominant memory should be organized around two fundamental principles. First, that we should count all the dead, not some of the dead. And secondly, we should treat all the dead as sharing a common humanity. When we look to the actual components of that memory, I would say that the first element should be that the use of atomic bombs, represented in the words of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the least abhorrent choice that was available to American leaders in 1945. We know now much more clearly than we had known in 1945, and particularly our knowledge has increased since the 1990s, and even more so within just literally the last year. If the Hiroshima bomb was the catalyst to the Emperor's intervention, what can we say about the Nagasaki bomb? Was it in fact necessary? And to answer that question, you have to understand the status of Japan's government in 1945. The legal government of Japan was that of Admiral Kentaro Suzuki. He had an inner cabinet which had the real power in Japan. It consisted of just 6 members. Only Togo, the foreign minister, was a civilian. The other 5 members were either senior admirals or generals. And this inner cabinet had convinced itself that they had devised a strategy which would bring a satisfactory end to the war from their standpoint. That is to say, an end to the war that would preserve the old order in Japan. They were convinced that the Americans were impatient and would come to invade Japan, striking at southern Kyushu. They'd identified that as the target. They built up enormous forces in Kyushu, and they believed that that initial invasion would either be defeated or they would inflict such high casualties on the Americans that the U.S. would switch to a negotiation to end the war under terms that Japanese leadership would find satisfactory. When you go into the details of how they looked at events, you find that when they received word of the Hiroshima bomb, the Imperial Army took the stance that they would not concede that the Americans had an atomic bomb without an investigation. The Imperial Navy took a far more ominous stance with respect to the situation. They said, well, the Americans may have one atomic bomb, but they can't have that many. They won't be that powerful. And maybe they'll be dissuaded by international pressure from using more atomic weapons. Now, the reason why this Japanese leadership took that stance was because of Japan's own atomic bomb program. This did not give the Japanese an atomic weapon, but it did instill knowledge up to the top levels of the Japanese leadership that producing fissionable material, which is what you have to fuel an atomic weapon, was incredibly difficult, incredibly complex, incredibly costly. Japan had attempted to do so and had failed, and this has instilled a knowledge in this top leadership that making fissionable material was extremely difficult. This is why the Japanese leadership, after they received word that Hiroshima had been hit by an atomic bomb, did not immediately decide that the war had ended the end. And this is exactly why the Nagasaki bomb was essential. Because with the Nagasaki bomb, it seemed to bluff or imply that the U.S. had an entire arsenal of atomic weapons. The U.S. could continue dropping those weapons until such time as the Japanese surrendered, and the U.S. would not attempt an invasion of Japan. If there was no invasion of Japan, then the strategy that the Suzuki's government was following was bankrupt, and there was no choice but to end the war, which is exactly what the emperor forced the Japanese leadership to decide in August 1945. And the second part of our memory and commemoration should be the fact that in August 1945, ending the war at that point halted this death toll of 250,000 civilians who were not Japanese, who were non-whites, that was going on every single month and had been going on every single month for 45 months and would continue as far as the eye could see. This effectively overturns the narrative that finds that 6% of the deaths in the Asia-Pacific War, which were Japanese, including less than 2% who died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the moral center around which we should form our judgments about how the war ended. And this means that we effectively treat the other 94% as though they do not count and they do not share a common humanity with the Japanese who died. I think when you reflect on that, you'll see that that is why we should call it the Asia-Pacific War and why we should recognize and count all the dead and treat them as sharing a common humanity. And now let me preview our speakers today. They will form an ensemble cast that I believe will both inform and entertain you. Amber Ponovas will school you on the use of fear and propaganda from its origins to its role in World War II. And this, you probably will notice, is a timely topic right down to today. Reb Busher will distill out from a multitude of stories about Hollywood during World War II the role of movies to generate anti-Japanese propaganda that exerted a role in the treatment of Japanese Americans, which is a timely reminder on an important part of the story of World War II we shouldn't forget. And Steve Rawl will dive us into the Japanese monster movie culture, foremost Godzilla, and the role of these celluloid novels, as I think of it, in mediating for the Japanese in the world, Japanese victimhood, and post-war pacifism. Janet Davis will stride us over the role of popular culture in maintaining public U.S. morale during World War II. That's an endlessly fascinating subject. Our fireside chat will feature Henry Sledge in conversation with our own General Michael Hagee, the 33rd Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Henry is the son of Eugene Sledge, author of With the Old Breed, which is widely regarded as among the greatest, if not the greatest, American memoir of the Asia-Pacific War. Henry will explain his amazing discoveries about the manuscript of With the Old Breed and his revealing interactions with his father over the years that will provide further insight into how With the Old Breed was prepared and what the messages were. I've provided you with the grim realities of the Asia-Pacific War, including a lot of numbers and some significant moral considerations as to how we should remember and commemorate these events. My colleagues are to carry the story forward in public memory interpretation, both during World War II and in the decades that follow thereafter. I will not be physically present with you today. I will be online monitoring these events, and I hope that you will find the conference will be as informative and entertaining as I certainly expect it to be. Thank you.